Record.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us tonight for Parshas Yisro. And this week's Parsha we have the Aseres HaDibros, right? The giving of the Torah, the Aseres HaDibros. So some very a lot of very conceptual, very key ideas in Judaism. I want to discuss a line in the Ibn Ezra's commentary, all right, which I'll tell you what the line is, and then there's a lot to say about this line, okay? There's a lot to say about it historically, philosophically, in terms of understanding the Parsha. There's just a lot going on in this line. The Ibn Ezra says, right, the first of the Aseres HaDibros, the first of the 10 commandments begins with Anochi Hashem Elokecha, right? I am the Lord your God. That's the first commandment, to believe that Hashem's our God. So it says, Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzeicha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am Hashem, the Lord your God, who took you out of Egypt. Okay, so the Ibn Ezra has a very long discussion of this whole, a lot of different aspects of this. But in the middle, so he writes the following line. He says, Sha'alani Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who's also very famous, right? The Ibn Ezra is very, very famous. He's one of our top commentators, one of the top grammarians and poets, and just one of the top people that knew Hebrew in the medieval period and in all of history. And he wrote some very, very important commentaries on the on the Torah, on the Tanakh. So a lot of very important, and he's he's world famous, right? I mean, Ibn Ezra is one of our most famous commentators. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is also very, very famous. Okay, and he was a world class, also a poet and a philosopher. He's best known for a book that he wrote called the Sefer HaKuzari. All right, the Kuzari, which is this discussion between a king and a Jew and a Jewish rabbi. The king is trying to convert. He's trying to figure out which religion is the right religion. And he calls in a priest and an imam and a philosopher and a rabbi. And he ends up, the rabbi, of course, ends up winning. It's a Jewish book. So the rabbi, of course, ends up winning. And that's the Kuzari, right? So the Kuzari is one of the most famous books of Jewish philosophy that we have. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is also, world famous. So we have these two people, the Ibn Ezra and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. And there's this anecdote that's reported in the Ibn Ezra's commentary, all right, which is Sha'alani Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi asked the Ibn Ezra, okay, he asked him, why does God introduce himself in the Aseres HaDibros as the God who took the Jews out of Egypt, and not with something much more basic, okay, which is the God who created the heaven and the earth, right? The God who created the world. Why does he start off with this introduction that he's the God of the Exodus instead of a much more impressive aspect, which is that he's the God of creation, right? Those are sort of two of the major pivots, major stories that we have, that God created the world and that God took the Jews out of Egypt. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi asked Ibn Ezra, why, when God is starting off the 10 commandments, does he choose to introduce himself through Yetzias Mitzrayim and not the creation of the world? He has a cute thing. He says that he should have said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, Sha'asisi Shamayim Ba'aretz, right? I'm the God who made the heavens and the earth, V'ani Asisicha, and I also made you, right? So that's a great way for God to introduce himself. Okay, so I want to focus our time tonight on this little anecdote, and I want to try to understand on a number of levels what's going on over here. First of all, there's a historical component to this story. Okay, then there's a philosophical component to this story. Okay, so we'll see that we'll see that this was not just a random question. This seems to have been a clash of two worldviews. And then, of course, it's also a very good question, right? It's a very good question on the Chumash, on the Parsha. Why does God choose to introduce himself like that at the Aseres HaDibros, and not, right? It's a good question just to deal with on the Parsha itself. All right, so I want to deal with those three different levels. Let's start with the history over here. Okay, first of all, how did Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Ibn Ezra come to be chatting like this? Okay, what was their connection? Because most of the great Rishonim that we have, right, the communication in those times, the ability to interact with other people was very, very low. I mean, they couldn't travel around that well, right? They didn't, communication just wasn't great. So most of the great Rishonim, not only did they never meet, for example, let's say Rashi and the Rambam, right? Or Rabbeinu Tam and the Rambam. I mean, Rabbeinu Tam and Rashi obviously had whatever connection they had because that was his grandfather. But Rishonim that lived in France and Rishonim that lived in Spain or in Israel or in Egypt never met each other. Not only did they never meet each other, they didn't even usually know about each other's writings. All right, which is an unbelievable thing. In other words, Rashi wrote this unbelievable commentary on the Torah and on the Gemara, and it doesn't seem like it even was known that such a thing existed in in Spain or in Egypt, right? Where the Rambam was writing a short while later. The same thing for the Rambam, right? The Rambam wrote an unbelievable book, and it seems like it took some time for it to make its way to France. So how did the Ibn Ezra and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi come to be such buddies over here? Okay, now both of them lived in Sephardic countries. Okay, so that obviously helped. But there's actually a lot of historical speculation about this. Okay, so on a simple level, it seems like they were just friends. Okay, that's because in the immediate period right after them, meaning in the years they lived around, let's say the 1100s. So in the immediate aftermath of their lives, whatever his history books were written, they only mention them being acquaintances. All right, and there's even a report that they both traveled to Africa together. All right, which was probably Morocco. But basically, there's a report. I don't know how reliable any of this stuff is, that they both took a trip to Africa together. So they were definitely friends. They definitely had some acquaintances with each other, and it makes sense because both of them were very, very prominent. The Ibn Ezra was a world famous grammarian and commentator. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was a world famous poet and philosopher. So it makes sense that they would get to know each other. They also traveled a good amount, both of them. All right, they were both big travelers. The Ibn Ezra was a very, very big traveler, so it makes sense that he would, that he would have met Rabbi Yehuda Halevi on one of his travels. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi also got around a lot. The Ibn Ezra is even quoted in Tosfos in one or two places. So again, it just shows you that he was very poor, but he also got around a lot. So okay, so that explains maybe how they got to know each other. But there's a rumor, all right? There's a historical rumor that some people report that the Ibn Ezra was Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's son-in-law. Okay, so he married his daughter. And there's this whole story that came up around this, which is that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was trying to write a poem, right? Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was very rich, and he only had one daughter. So, a lot of people wanted to marry her because she came with a big dowry, and her father was a prominent guy. So he was trying to write a poem, and he couldn't figure out one of the letters. It had to be in the Aleph bet acrostic, and he got stuck on one of the lines. So he went home for the night, and the Ibn Ezra was like this anonymous guy in the shul, and he saw the poem lying there, and he filled in the hard stanza. So Rabbi Yehuda Halevi came back in the morning. He saw that the poem was finished, or that this stanza was written in, and he said, "Who was this?" And when he saw it was the Ibn Ezra, so he immediately married him off to his daughter. Right? I guess if you're a poet, right, you want a poet for a son-in-law. Okay. Well, I'll come to. Let's hold off on that for a minute. Okay, this is a very widespread story. Rav Soloveitchik even repeats the story. But okay, let's hold off on that story. As you can tell, right, this story is almost certainly a Baba Maisa. It's the kind of story that arises over the years, but it's almost certainly it's almost certainly not true. The third option is there's another rumor that they were cousins, that their mothers were sisters. Okay, so they both came from the same family. And then there's some people that think they were both cousins, and the Ibn Ezra was married, the Kuzari's daughter, right, which was what they used to do back in the day. Now, the problem with this story that he was his son-in-law is that in the Parsha, right, in this commentary on Yisro, when he quotes Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, he doesn't call him my father-in-law. All right. And that would be very unusual for a commentator to quote his father-in-law and to not identify him as his father-in-law. All right. So because of that, there's a problem with this story that that the Ibn Ezra was Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's son-in-law. And so one of the traditionalist answers is that the Ibn Ezra married the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's daughter after Rabbi Yehuda Halevi died. All right. So when he wrote the commentary, or when he talked to him, he wasn't his son-in-law yet. And then after Rabbi Yehuda Halevi died, he married his daughter. All right. Let me just end this. Historians, I think there is a historian who looked through the Cairo Geniza, and what he discovered is what it looks like. Okay, and this would explain a lot of this information. What it looks like is that the Ibn Ezra's son Yitzchak married Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's daughter. All right, so that's how all the rumors started. In other words, they were friends. Okay, the Ibn Ezra and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi were friends. They were both great poets, great commentators. And then Ibn Ezra's son and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's daughter got married, right, which makes sense. They made a shidduch together. And over the years, the story snowballed into the Ibn Ezra himself being Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's son-in-law. All right. Either way, that's the historical component of this whole story. Okay, whether they were friends or something closer, whether they were relatives, what is clear is that at some point they met, and they were, as befits two great Torah scholars, they were discussing Torah topics. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi asked the Ibn Ezra this question that he records, which is, why does Hashem introduce himself as the God of Yetzias Mitzrayim and not as the God of creation? Now, let's go to the philosophical component of this. Okay, what I think and what I want to try to show is that I don't think this wasn't just a random question that he asked him. Okay, it wasn't just like a technicality. But what we have over here is really a meeting, like a clash of two major philosophical worldviews that are clashing over here. Okay, and I assume they must have been maybe discussing this issue, and they were having an intense debate. And as part of that debate, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi asked him this question, and the proof for that is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi in the Kuzari discusses this question himself. Okay, so I don't think this was, and it's a very central part of his whole philosophy. So I don't think that he was asking him this question because he didn't have an answer, right? He had his own answer that he was probably maybe sharing with the Ibn Ezra, but as we'll see, the Ibn Ezra had a totally different answer. All right, so what's the philosophical clash? Let me go to the two worldviews over here. There's a major debate between medieval Jewish philosophers about what's the best way to know God. All right. Knowing God or proving the existence of God is something that's not that important nowadays, right? I don't think a lot of us lose a lot of sleep about how to prove the existence of God. But in the medieval period, 1,000 years ago, this was a very, very big deal. All right. Everybody was trying to prove the existence of God. Now, why that changed is a good conversation for another time. But let's go back, 1,000 years ago. All right. And there's a big emphasis on not just believing in God because someone told you to believe in God, right? They didn't want to believe in God just because their parents told them to believe in God, but they wanted to believe in God because they could prove it. Okay. They could prove it to themselves that this was the right thing to believe. Question was, what's the best way to go about proving God's existence? So the standard philosophical answer, right? This was the Rambam's approach. The standard philosophical answer was that the best way to prove the existence of God was through philosophy. Okay, which is what we would call today science, right? Like physics, right? Using the laws of physics, using the laws of science, using the philosophical arguments of logic, you could prove the existence of God. All right, and if people that have studied the history of philosophy, so you'll see that all these philosophers, not just Jewish philosophers, Christian philosophers, Muslim philosophers, all sorts of philosophers in that period were trying to prove the existence of God using the laws of logic. Okay. Now the Kuzari, who was somewhat of an anti-philosopher, all right, a lot of his philosophy is sort of an anti-philosophy. So the Kuzari came around and he said, you know what? The best way to prove the existence of God is not through physics. It's not through logic. It's not through philosophy. It's through history. Okay, the best way to prove the existence of God is when you look at Jewish history, when you study the events of Jewish history, when you see the relationship that God's had with the Jews, the way that he's taken care of them, the way that he's interacted with them, the way that he's always been there for them, that he's been willing to change the normal, natural course of events in order to affect the Jews some way or another. So when you study that, you see the presence of God in the world. So again, this is a very fundamental debate, right? The philosophers, and I mean Jewish philosophers, the Rambam, right? Great Jewish philosophers, they believe that philosophy and logic were the best way to prove God. The Kuzari believed that the best way to prove God was through the study of Jewish history. Okay, so this is a very, very big, a big divide between philosophy and history. Now, there's benefits and there's good and bad to both, right? Like everything in life, there's good and bad to both options. The benefit of the philosophy track is that it's universal, right? When you prove the existence of God using logic, it's not just for Jews. It's for everybody. It's for non-Jews. Anybody in the world could follow that logic. When you prove the existence of God using Jewish history, so that's really only for the Jews who are connected to that history. So that's why the philosophers wanted something that was more universal as opposed to something like the Kuzari, which was more particular, which was more specific to the Jewish people. The Kuzari, on the other hand, believed that the Jews have a special role in the world, right? The Jews are different than everybody else. They have a special mission in the world. And we shouldn't use arguments that are universal. We should use arguments that speak specifically to the Jews, right? The Kuzari was a real nationalist about this. He believed that the Jews have a special role, and the best arguments are the ones that are going to speak to the Jews and only the Jews. So that's why the Kuzari preferred the study of Jewish history as a proof of God more than the study of philosophy, which is more universal. All right, so this was a very fundamental debate, a fundamental two different worldviews about what's the proper way to prove God, and what's the Jews' relationship with the rest of the world. Okay, now let's come back to our pasuk that we began with, and we'll see that these two philosophies clash, so to speak, when it comes to reading this pasuk. All right, the Torah says, I am Hashem, Anochi Hashem Elokecha asher hotzicha me'eretz Mitzrayim. I am God who took you out of Egypt. So the Kuzari says, why did God introduce himself as the God of Yetzias Mitzrayim and not the God of creation? You know why? Because the God of creation is an abstract philosophical concept. It's a scientific concept. It's a God of creation that you can study through the laws of science. But the better way to understand God is through Jewish history, meaning Yetzias Mitzrayim. So that's exactly what God was saying at the beginning of the Aseres HaDibros. The first way that he introduced himself is that the best way to know about Hashem, the best way to study Hashem, is Jewish history, which is Yetzias Mitzrayim, more so than creation, which is the laws of science. Okay? So it was exactly this point that the Kuzari is saying, that Jewish history is superior to philosophy. It's exactly that Hashem was saying at the Ten Commandments, that I am the God of Yetzias Mitzrayim, meaning the God who appears in Jewish history, as opposed to the God of science. All right, that's what the Kuzari says. On the other hand, the Ibn Ezra, now again, right, you remember the Kuzari asked this question to the Ibn Ezra. And I think it's possible that the Kuzari was telling him his whole approach to the world. The Ibn Ezra gives a totally different answer to this question. He doesn't quote Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's answer at all, but he gives a totally different answer. And he says the following. He says that in any community, you're going to have two types of people. You're going to have people who can prove the existence of God, right? They're the elite philosophers. So they're able to prove God's existence. And then you have the regular, the regular people, the majority of people who are just simple folk, right? They can't prove God's existence philosophically. They just believe God because of their own experiences of the world, right? Because of what they were taught to believe. So even the philosophers who think it's important to prove the existence of God, right? Even a lot of them have to admit that not everyone can do that, right? There's people that are not that educated. There's people that might not be that sophisticated, right? There's people that might not be able to go along this road and prove God's existence. So says the Ibn Ezra, you know what Hashem was doing when he introduced himself at the Aseret Adibros? He was speaking to each of these different groups on their own level. So he started off and he said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am Hashem your Lord. That was the introduction for the philosophers. And what he was saying is, I am Hashem, I am the creator of the world, I am God, and go ahead and prove it philosophically. All right, your job as philosophers is to go ahead and prove my existence philosophically, logically. And then he said, Asher Hotzeisicha Meretz Mitzrayim, that was, you have to divide the sentence in two. When he said, I took you out of Egypt, he was talking to the simple folk, to the regular people. And he said, you can't prove my existence logically, but you experienced the Exodus, so you know that I'm your God. Okay, so according to the Ibn Ezra, this is a little bit of a forced approach, but according to the Ibn Ezra, you have to sort of split this pasuk in half. You got to cut it in half. Okay, the first half is I am Hashem, I am the Lord your God. And the second half is who took you out of Egypt. And each of these phrases is talking to a different group. The first phrase, I am God, is speaking to the philosophers, and that's all they need to know. They don't care about the Exodus. All they need to know is that there's a God, and then they can go ahead and prove it logically. And then the I who took you out of Egypt was for the simple people who couldn't prove it logically, so they needed to know that this was God who took them out of Egypt. All right, so that's how the Ibn Ezra reads it. So again, you see the Ibn Ezra's approach follows the Rambam's idea, right? The standard philosophical approach that ideally you can prove God's existence philosophically, but if not, so then you can just believe in God based on your own experiences or based on what you've been taught. All right, so this is a very interesting debate between the Ibn Ezra and Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Like I said, it seems like these two worldviews really met up, not just in theory, but also practically, right? It seems like there was this moment in the medieval period when these two towering Torah giants met up and they had a conversation and they maybe discussed some of these ideas, right? But basically they came to two totally different conclusions based on this pasuk, right? The Torah introduces God as the God who took the Jews out of Egypt, not the God of creation. And according to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, that's to tell us that history is more important in studying God than philosophy is. And then according to the Ibn Ezra, though, that's to tell us the totally opposite, that if someone's a philosopher, then they should study God logically. But if they're not able to do that, so then they can believe in God just based on their own, based on what they've been taught. All right, so very, very interesting to see how these major worldviews both try to make sense of this pasuk. Okay, now in the few minutes that I have left over here, what I want to do now is segue to the third issue, okay? Because this is not only a philosophical issue, but it's also an issue in the pasuk, right? Why did the Torah why does God introduce himself as the God of Yetzias Mitzrayim and not as the God of creation? So I want to go now to some other commentators, all right? Because, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was not the first commentator to question this. Rashi already quotes this question. All right, and Rashi quotes the following answer. Rashi and the Ramban both suggest a totally different approach over here. Nothing to do with belief in God. All right, up until now, right, both approaches that we've discussed are about the proper way to believe in God. Rashi and the Ramban suggest a totally different idea, which is, what is God coming to do right now? He's not just telling them to believe in him. He's also giving them a bunch of commandments to follow. Right? He's not just saying, believe in me and that's it. He's giving them a whole list of commandments that they're supposed to obey. So Rashi and the Ramban explain that the reason why God introduced himself as the God of Yetzias Mitzrayim is because he's trying to say, because I freed you, You owe me one, right? You used to be slaves, and you would have been serving the Pharaoh, but I freed you. So because I'm the one that freed you from the Egyptian slavery, you should obey my laws. You should obey my laws instead, right? It's like, right, let's say let's say an employer, right? Let's say a guy has a job, right? And someone comes to him and says, listen, I'll pay you whatever salary you were making, but I want you to work for me instead. So fine, that guy now has a new job, right? So that's what Hashem was trying to tell the Jews. You're not free from Egypt to do whatever you want, right? You're free from Egypt to come work for me instead. You're not free, really. You were slaves in Egypt, and now you're my slaves, right? You do what I tell you to do instead, right? This is one of the themes that we talk about a lot at Pesach, that the Jews were not freed from Egypt just to be free, right? They left Egypt in order to go serve God instead of serving Pharaoh. So that's what Hashem was trying to tell them right now. You used to be slaves in Egypt. So that's why since I freed you, I took you to be my slave. So now I'm giving you all these commandments. All right. So that's how they interpret it. Now, okay. So that's a very nice approach, I think. And like I said, it's a major theme of Pesach. It's a very nice idea. I do think there's a problem with it though, because I don't know why is that any different than if Hashem had said, I'm the God that created the world and created you, right? It's the same idea. If I created you, right? It's like, let's say someone builds a robot, right? So they would say to the robot, I made you, now do what I tell you to do, right? So I'm not sure why. I don't totally understand. I guess I'm going to leave this as a question. I don't have an answer to this, but I think this is a good question on Rashi and the Ramban's approach. Right? Why did God need to focus on Yetzias Mitzrayim in order to tell the Jews to keep the mitzvahs? Why couldn't he focus on creation, which it's the same point, right? If Hashem is telling the Jews, you have to follow my laws because I freed you from Egypt, he could have made the exact same point and said, you have to follow my laws because I created the world. All right, so, okay, let me leave that as a question. Let me share one last approach. Again, this is from Rashi. Also, a totally different idea for this whole question. All right, but this is also a very interesting idea. Rashi says that the reason Hashem said this had nothing to do with introducing himself, and it had nothing to do with explaining why they should believe in him, and it had nothing to do with explaining why they should keep the mitzvahs, nothing to do with any of that. It was a totally different issue, which is the Jews had just seen the splitting of the sea. And God appeared at the splitting of the sea like a mighty, powerful warrior. Now, when God appeared at the giving of the Torah, a short while later, so he appeared as like a wise old sage. So the problem was that the Jews were worried. Hashem was worried that the Jews were going to think this must be two different gods. Right? There must be a God that's a strong God, and there must be a God that's a wise God. There must be two different guys because we just saw two different gods. So that's why he said, no. I'm the same God that took you out of Egypt, right? Don't think this is a second God who's giving you the Torah. It's the same God who took you out of Egypt who's also giving you the Torah, right? The Gemara even talks about that some of the non-Jews were confused by this. Throughout history, and they actually made the mistake of thinking that God had lost his power or whatever it is, because God appears in different places and different times in different ways. But of course, it's not that God ever loses power. It's that in different situations, he responds differently. So that's what God was trying to tell the Jews here, that he didn't lose any power. He didn't change in any way. He just is responding to different situations in different ways. But it's the same God who took them out of Egypt who's giving them the Torah. So that's why he said, I took you out of Egypt in order to emphasize that point. All right. So those are four options to answer this question. There are some other options even, but those I think are four good solutions to this problem. Again, let me just quickly review them. Again, the question is, why does God introduce himself as the God of Yetzias Mitzrayim and not the greater accomplishment of creating the world? So one answer that we saw is because the best way to connect with God is through the study of Jewish history, better than the study of logic. Answer number two that we saw is that God was trying to make himself available for everybody wherever they're at. He wanted to reach the maximum amount of people. So for the elites, he communicated in a philosophical way. And for the regular people, so he communicated in the simplest way possible by reminding them of their own lived experiences. All right. Option number 3 that we saw is that God was trying to specifically explain to them why they need to keep the mitzvahs. All right. And the rationale for that is because since he took them out of Egypt, so therefore they now need to obey his commandments instead. And option number 4 is that that God was trying to avoid a problem. He didn't want them to get confused and to think that there must be 2 different gods, the powerful God from Egypt and the wise God from the giving of the Torah. So he emphasized that it's the same God. He just appears in different places depending on how he's needed. All right. Thank you again, everyone. Let me